Good afternoon, everyone, and apologies for starting slightly delayed. My name is Neha Sami, and I'm one of the faculty here at IHS, and I also anchor the research program here. Welcome to the first plenary for this year's Urban Arc. We're very, very excited about this panel, particularly because it focuses on work that is core to the IHS mission of developing an urban curriculum for the Global South. This draws not only on our own pedagogical experiment here at IHS, but it also brings together the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years through the KNOW project. Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, or KNOW, is a GCRF-funded research project that's led by the DPU at UCL. And the project and the work going on there is a response to the growing inequality in our cities. One of the strands of research that we've been doing through KNOW has explicitly focused on the relationship between planning education and urban inequality. We're particularly interested in understanding through this research how pedagogies of practitioners, institutions, and networks can become generative to urban equality. Through the course of the research over the last 4 years, we've been engaging with a range of pedagogues, urban practitioners at institutions, and we wanted to bring all of this sort of the depth and breadth of this knowledge together and share our learnings. Mainly also to acknowledge that thinking about pedagogy and innovations around education cannot be done in isolation, and it needs to be done collectively in groups like this. And so in that spirit, we're also with this plenary launching a 4-part panel series that will focus on a set of questions around urban pedagogy that we hope will begin a set of conversations and allow us both the time and the space to reflect on our own practice and also help us to learn collectively together to do better. I'd like to invite Yulia now to introduce the session and the panelists.
Thank you so much to Neha and to the IHS team for really conceptualizing and organizing this exciting seminar dialogue series. So as Neha was saying, that's the first of a series which is called Developing an Urban Curriculum for the Global South. And it really brings together reflections on concrete experiences of teaching, learning, and practicing urban equality from Cuba, from Tanzania, from South Africa, India, as well as across regions. And as the opening panel of this 4-part series, the idea is really to use the reflections to provoke translocal discussions on the very difficult challenges which urban planning education is facing right now. And as we know, these include efforts to decolonize the curriculum, to situate the curriculum within wider processes of rethinking the role of the university and of urban pedagogues as one of many actors in urban development, along with the state, the private sector, civil society organizations, and others. And it includes how to decide what to teach and learn together in the face of really the diversity, the depth, the complexity of urban inequalities, the manifestations in planning education itself, but then also the manifestations in the urban practices that are emanating from planning education. So the panel, I think, is by no means meant to be a conclusive encounter, but rather an opening of discussions based on concrete experiences, which we will take forward then in the 3 sessions that will follow today. And we're incredibly fortunate, I think, to host and bring together an incredible panel of speakers and of discussants, whose experiences as urban pedagogues are so rich that we couldn't possibly fit them into one slot of this conference. So what we're going to do is we will start in the first round with presentations of 15 minutes each by Professor Caren Levy, by Professor Wilbard Kombe, and by Professor Edgar Peterson, followed by short comments from Professor Adriana Allen, and then a question and answer. And the second panel, when we're coming back, we'll have presentations from Professor Darshini Mahadevia, Professor Jorge Pena Diaz, and Joiselen Cazanave Macías, as well as Professor Aromar Revi. And then again, we will have enough space for question, answers, and closing remarks from Adriana Allen. As this is a webinar, please, as you have questions, put them in the question and answer box or in the chat. We will monitor that closely and then just bring them all together. So I would like to first introduce you to Professor Caren Levy. who is our first speaker and the principal investigator of the KNOW program, the Knowledge and Action for Urban Equality program. She's professor of transformative urban planning at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at University College London. Her research focuses on community-led approaches to planning and governance in the Global South, with a special interest in the institutionalization of social justice in policy and planning, particularly related to cross-cutting issues of gender diversity and environment. Caren has over 35 years of experience of teaching, research, training, consultancy, and developing innovatory approaches to planning methodology, planning education, and capacity building, engaging with communities, governments, international organizations, both in London and abroad in a range of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Caren, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be part of this IHS event. A critical approach to planning education is absolutely central to the history and the development of the DPU. And so not surprisingly, this has been the basis of both mine and the wider DPU's engagement with IHS since 2009. We've been on an extraordinary journey together in this discussion about curriculum development and planning education. In this opening panel on the developing an urban curriculum for the Global South, I want to draw on the experience of the KNOW program that Julia outlined. And I want to really focus, I'll leave the details, leave the KNOW team to share their work of the 4 years in more detail on this theme. But I want to focus on and unpack the rationale for why we believed that the inclusion of this work stream on multiplying translocal learning in higher education, why did we think that this work stream was so essential for shaping pathways to urban equality? And in doing this, in a sense, I'm going to use my participation in this panel just to frame a big picture framing around questions of urban curriculum development. I'm going to share my screen now. And what I want to do is to start with the nature of urban inequalities that face us, which are increasingly widening everywhere. And in doing this, I'm going to share the KNOW, if you like, the KNOW version of how we've developed over the 4 years, what we think is important, the 4 important dimensions of urban equality. First of all, what we've seen are growing socioeconomic and spatial cleavages and inequalities with consequences for a dignified and sustainable quality of life of most urban dwellers. In this sense, what we see increasingly is not an equal distribution, but a maldistribution in many parts of, in many cities of the Global South, and indeed of the Global North as well. A second dimension relates to what we've called reciprocal recognition. And here what we see is in most contexts, a malrecognition of diverse social identities, the intersection of class, of gender, of age, of ethnicity, of religion, of disability. In other words, the full range of social identities is very badly recognized, both within the context of planning and of the everyday life of cities. And this is obviously related to the claims made by these different identity groups. And what we could start to identify perhaps is a growing set of epistemic injustices in the way that knowledge and experience of these different groups are represented in the city. We also see the exclusion and the malrepresentation of citizens in the deliberations, the imaginaries, and the decisions about the current and future city. In other words, within urban governance structures around the participation in decision-making and deliberations, in many parts of the world, people are excluded from that process, which to us represents a key dimension of urban inequality. And finally, in terms of solidarity and mutual care, we see an exploitation of this role often but often in an unrecognized way, and an undermining of it increasingly of solidarity and care between citizens and nature. This role has taken on a rather unique and special role in the context of the pandemic. Despite government's actions, communities have come together, often without the support that they need, in order to help provide the solidarity and mutual care that has been required. And obviously often at great cost to themselves and to others. And so I think when we think of inequalities and addressing inequalities in the curriculum, this gives a sense of the array of issues that need to be addressed in terms of inequalities. But I would say what's important here is it's important to understand in any curriculum is how do urban practices and structural drivers actually reproduce inequalities. And more specifically in my session on this, in this panel, I want to look at how is planning and planning education implicated in the reproduction of these urban inequalities. Now, in doing this, I think in terms of that framing of this question, I've taken a bigger picture view and really trying to think about how we position planning education. And I would argue that if we're looking at the urban curriculum, we have to be conscious of at least two dimensions, which I'd like to unpack a little bit more: the history and international political economy of planning itself, and the international political economy of higher education, which I think plays out in terms of framing urban curriculum in planning education. And within this intersection of both discursive and material practices, I think it's important, as Julia already intimated, in terms of a curriculum, we begin to better understand what knowledge is central to that curriculum and why, why that knowledge and why not other knowledge. And critically, how is it acquired? How is it learned? From where and from whom? So these are for me, some of the key questions to think about. And if we go and we look at, let's start with the international political economy of planning, of what we can recognize is that the origins of planning were in the global north, particularly in the UK and other global north countries, developed in very, very different contexts from the situation that was faced by many countries. And also, of course, that experience was disseminated through a colonial history, but a very particular colonial history in which planning was used as a mechanism of order, a reflection of colonial rule. In other words, the city for resident colonialists and local elites, but also as a mechanism of social control, often related to managing the spatial proximity of workers for the colonial economy. And so planning had a very particular footprint in the context of a colonial history. In a post-colonial context, we've seen the growth of many different kinds of global structures governing trade, economy, sustainable development over time. And these different entities, of course, the question is, who is represented in these entities and how, and what interests are played out in these entities, and how do they have implications for urban development becomes pretty crucial. And more specifically, in that post-colonial structure, we've seen the growth of a development industry, let's call it that, okay, which has really fostered the transfer of planning ideas through bilateral and multilateral aid internationally, with the use of a growing body of consultants moving about the world, promoting particular approaches to planning and development. And through that approach, what one begins to start to have to unpack is that, in a sense, planning was, or in a sense, universalized, driven by notions of modernization. it's kind of a stereotype vision of modernization. Some people have referred to it in the context of Indian development as the Shanghaiization of cities. But the key thing about this notion of modernization, in the words of our esteemed colleague Vanessa Watson, is a kind of urbanization that sweeps the poor away. And so it very, very problematic vision of planning, which doesn't necessarily talk to all residents in cities. Through this, we've seen the universalization of dominant planning concepts like the public interest, as if there's one public interest, the notion of order, of single-use zoning, of densities, of building materials. And the expression of this can be found in any planning statute in almost any city of a post-colonial city of our world. And in that process, we've also seen a rather, I've called it here as Scott and Ruiz referred to it many, many years ago, as a contextless set of planning methodologies, primarily represented by the so-called rational comprehensive planning approach, a teaching of planning, of how to do planning in a very linear kind of a concept, a linear way, which doesn't really reflect the very powerful barriers to developing, certainly to addressing urban equality. And with that came this notion of the expert planning, which was, of course, over time has changed as to who that expert is in the context of the statutory provisioning of planning. That expert has been situated in the state, but with the neoliberal thinking, that expert sometimes moves, it comes from the private sector. But certainly that notion of expert carries with it all kinds of challenges to particular sets of relations. And so if we're thinking about an urban curriculum, how is an understanding and critique of these structural drivers in urban practices reflected in an urban curriculum? I mean, to what extent, for example, if we challenge this notion of diversity and modernization, to what extent does an urban curriculum really talk to a city for all, to the right to the city? To what extent does an urban curriculum actually recognize the diversity of interests and experiences in urban life, which works in quite a critique of the kind of approaches that I've talked about? Very, very critically, to what extent does an urban curriculum around, to what extent does it recognize the notion of informality, the notion that informality is a mode of urbanization, in the words of Roy, that it actually informal settlements, which constitute very large proportions of many cities of the world, has a valuable contribution to make to the city as a whole. How is that recognized in an urban curriculum and taught? In other words, to be basic, how can we move away from the criminalization of informality, which has accompanied so much planning and led to so much a range of kind of forced evictions in many, many cities? And how does an urban curriculum move away from a kind of contextless set of planning methodologies and actually recognize the capacity to assess the room for maneuver for more equitable planning practices in the city? And how does an urban planning curriculum challenge the notion of the expert and who is the planner? To what extent does an urban curriculum recognize the everyday practices of ordinary people in city, in the making of the city, recognize the organized civil society's contributions to the making of their neighborhoods and to the city? In other words, a real challenging of who the planner is, and a deconstructing of this notion of so-called expert. Still recognizing that the planner has a role, that planners in state capacities in the private sector have roles, they have knowledge, but they're not the only planners in the city. So if I move now to looking at education and the political economy of education, what we're talking about here is recognizing that in a colonial history, what we're talking about is really an education that was really for middle-class men to really populate the colonial state. And this has tinged the way in which education in itself is developed. Of course, this is changed in many different ways in a post-colonial context. The growth of structures like the UNESCO, a commitment to education for all has completely transformed the way we think about education. But we also have seen, just like we did in planning, a post-colonial growth of development industry related to specifically to education and to higher education, and indeed to planning education. And what that kind of history has also promoted is a kind of universalization of what knowledge is valued in curriculum development. It hasn't always, in other words, there are inequalities in the dominant modes of knowledge reproduction and the way in which education is rewarded. For example, in the way that publications, the valuation structure of publications, in terms of resource flows in education, we see a very unequal political economy internationally of education. And indeed, in the context of research, until very recently, a kind of almost extractive research from the global south to the global north in a very questionable framework of a particular set of research ethics. Now, we've done a lot to critique this over time, but it has to be kept in mind as a framework for rethinking the way that planning education is developed. And not only that, but we also have to confront unequal patterns of who is learning and where, and inequalities in the dominant learning methodologies. So if we think about what this means for an urban curriculum, how is an understanding and critique of these kind of structural drivers and urban practices reflected in the structure of urban education and the development of an urban curriculum, then we must ask questions about what knowledge is valued and why. We must ask questions about who are the learners. And we have to ask questions about learning pedagogies that challenge the reproduction of educational inequalities, and building the capacity of what does it mean, building the capacity of faculty to address inequalities. And to what extent faculty are also learners in this process, and creating alternative publication structures and resource flows in educational framing in order to ensure the inclusion, the wide inclusion of learners, of both learners, but also faculty in the process of developing education. So I'll end there really to say that these are the questions that we wanted to look at closely and were the reasons that drove us to choose a work stream specifically looking at planning education, and that specifically then informed and framed the way in which the team took forward in specific contexts the challenge of curriculum development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caren, for articulating so clearly and so eloquently the political economy of planning and higher education, and really the difficult sets of universal, contextless, modernized, extractive, discourses and concepts, which urban curricula need to talk to, in order to be able to redress this colonial footprint of planning, the post-colonial manifestations of it, and to work towards those 4 dimensions of urban equality that you introduced at the beginning. So thank you for that. And I think a lot of food for thought and a lot of also avenues where our following speakers will tap into. So next up is Professor Wilbard Kombe, who is the director of the Institute of Human Settlement Studies at Ardhi University in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where he is professor of urban land management. He is a co-investigator in NO in the work on knowledge co-production, and is also NO's Africa regional lead. Professor Kombe's research focuses on land management, governance of informal urbanization, and governance of water and sanitation in peri-urban areas. And as a pedagogue, Professor Kombe has been a constant core actor, I think, in rethinking, transforming planning education, both at his home institution as well as in the wider work of the Association of African Planning Schools. So, Professor Kombe, I hand over to you.
Hello? Hello?
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, we could hear you.
Okay. Okay.
Welcome.
Very much, colleagues, for inviting me to participate in these very interesting sessions. And I believe strongly that what Caren has presented, I'll try to provide some insights in terms of the reality of what's happening around, especially in the context of African countries, sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically the Tanzanian context, the issue of curriculum, training of planners, and the challenges which we are facing. Sorry. Next slide.
Professor Kombe, you're on mute currently.
Yeah, I'll present the context of African cities. I'll look at the issues of trends in terms of training of planners and planning education in the region. And then I'll shortly go into the challenges and the way forward, or at least food for thought. What I'm trying to argue in this first slide is that we are seeing, as in all other countries, urbanization which we are not able to cope with, as Caren has put it, a large informality, which is the mode of urbanization in our countries, inadequate public resources and capacities, including for planning and management of urban areas, and little absence of preparedness and responses to global trends such as globalization, climate change, and pandemics. These are really challenges which are facing us and which calls for intervention. Next, please. We are also observing that in most of African countries, education planning institutions were established rather late, but with the exception of South Africa in 1943, they had the diploma at Wits already. Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, University of Technology, they had a program in 1958. But the rest of the countries, including Tanzania, Malawi, Nigeria, Botswana, etc., came late in the 70s, and even Botswana is even a later comer after year 2000. Planned education system and practice based on training of curricula developed in the West largely, that Caren has underlined adequately. Recent curricula comprise an alloy of ABC schools, AAP schools, Netherlands, Portugal, Scandinavia, and other Western countries. Largely, we have reviewed them, we have tried to modify them, but largely based on the ideas from also a lot of them from outside the African region. Over the years, planned education curricula evolved, but to depict poverty, resources, staff restrictions, global issues of climate change. But there is little action in terms of the relationship between these reviews, which have been taken to take into account the poverty, and the actual planning on the ground or training on the ground. However, planning schemes and instruments for regulating planning we also have a long history. For example, in Tanzania, the Germans introduced long time in 1912 already a planning scheme for Dar es Salaam. Nigeria, 1928 already. Zambia, 1929. Therefore, we see the practice on the planning system which were used to regulate, but the thinking of training was not there during that time. Please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Huh? Next, please. Okay. What are the trends in curriculum development? We have mixed the systems in terms of decentralized system of planning systems. In Botswana, for example, highly centralized. Nigeria is Tanzania is pseudo-centralized. South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana are exception. They are highly centralized systems. In most cases, planning, education, training, narrowly understood as and focused on spatial planning. If you look at all these 10 programs, apart from a few exceptions, the focus is understanding planning as a spatial development issue, and not really as a comprehensive issue which addresses socio-economic, political, and institutional aspects of development, of urban development. Increasing merging of theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge, but with a little underscoring the integrated nature of urban development processes. Despite reviews and contextualization, effectiveness of planning in most countries is disproportionately low, and it has failed to tackle the burning problems or issues in the cities: informality, widening social spatial inequalities, deliver affordable land and housing, etc., etc. Therefore, planning has been there, is been contextualized, it's been changed, but effectiveness on the ground is limited. Planning, education, learning, and training system, part of the problem. If you look at these problems which plan is trying to tackle, if you look at the education which is being offered, if you look at what is happening on the ground, you realize that plan education is really becoming part of the problem, because it has not been able to deliver planners who are able to turn the education which they receive into practical, usable tool on the ground. And that is really a challenge we are facing in the region. Next. We still have some of the challenges we experience, we still have a very central and municipal governments which are very powerful and which have a say on the plans and planning, meaning that they can say this is the kind of plan we want, and these are the kind of output we want from planners. And therefore, planning is really a power issue. Who has a decision, who has power to make what decision essentially? And what I'm trying to argue is that as long as the municipalities have autonomous powers in terms of what type of plans they want in planning. And a good example, Dar es Salaam. When we tried to introduce strategic urban planning, UN spent a lot of money in Dar es Salaam in the early 1990s, transform from master plan to strategic planning, only to be refused by the custodian of the plan, the Minister of Land, saying, no, this is not the plan which you want. And that failed after almost 10 years and a lot of money which was put into several strategic plans and training of manpower, changing the attitude, looking at the city from a more strategic perspective of collective investment as well as collective action. This was completely abandoned later because the minister simply didn't want to buy the argument. And this is one of the issues which I'm emphasizing, that it is a power issue. And the minister clearly, the bureaucrats of the ministry felt that they were not in position to assimilate that concept because they had not been trained in that area. And definitely they will lose their job or they will not fit in their position if they were to accept that one. And they use a number of reasons to say, no, this is not the plan we want back to master planning. Mastering concepts and therefore theories and techniques when you are facing issues of implementable plans and issues of planners who cannot address challenge of cities, we see little connection between educators and interaction with the community or with the industry, because they are producing good planners who have good ideas of concepts, theories, and techniques. But when you look on the ground to see whether they are able to make a change, then you see very little connection between what they are doing and the industry or the practitioners and policymakers. Training of planners and learning is done without adequate contextualization, meaning there's a lot of thinking about context, but it's not contextualized in the sense of what can be addressed this critical challenge we are facing and under what conditions and what exists. Curricula in most institutions are not sensitive to the planning context, particularly society knowledge and social actors, which is the source of urban inequality and poverty issues. What I'm trying to emphasize is that when we look at our current planning curricula in most institutions, they are not sensitive, they adequately sensitive to the planning context, particularly the role being played by social knowledge, society knowledge, and social actor at the grassroots, in the absence of planning, especially many informal settlements. And we are therefore seeing a kind of a change where the urban inequalities and poverty are increasing, largely because we have not been able to adequately contextualize planning. This in terms of curricula, in terms of training, and in terms of learning. Next, please. There's little social learning that is to assess local potentials, forge strategic partnership with change agents on the ground. What we are saying is that informal actors, social institutions, civil societies are doing a lot on the ground. They are the barefooted planners who are making development in the informal sector, which comprise a large proportion of most of our cities in sub-Saharan Africa. But their potentials are not recognized. Therefore, there is little social learning among planners and trainees and the educators about what is happening on the ground and how can it inform teaching and training. Lack of institutionalized mechanism between universities and industry to share knowledge and research findings. There are no formal institutionalized, at least in Tanzania and several other countries. Research at the universities considered research being done for the university publication but it's not usually looked at as a source of knowledge generation that can make a change, that can address specific problems in the community. Planning, education, and training tend to promote compartments and learning compartment in terms of learning environment, and therefore not addressing cross-disciplinary collaboration and partnership, which is emphasized in theory and practice in many discussions and academic and policy. But when you look on the ground of training planners, there are compartments. At my own university, we have surveyors, we have architects, we have engineers, we have training of planners, both regional and urban designers, we have architects, but all these do not have a common ear where they work together as a team. And therefore you see this very apparent gap between training and the practice. There is also little education, little cooperation between planning education institutions and extracurricular education or outreach programs. In my university, we've started an outreach program, but it's not funded. Unfortunately, it was established by CEDA, but it's not receiving any funding from the government because it's not considered an important part of university. The extracurricular, outreach program of going to the community to work with the community, to establish, to enlighten the community about certain things which have been uncovered in research work. These are not funded by government because they are not considered part of the program of the past. And this is, again, the area where I'm saying that as long as government have an upper hand on the training and content of the program, they may even cut off some of the field work because they think it's too expensive. It's not necessary. You can train planners without going to the field. These are part of the challenges which are there when you are thinking about curriculum development. Disregard of society knowledge is a critical issue and experiences in planning, education, curriculum, and training. In our NO project, we have uncovered and we've discovered interesting role being played by society, by grassroots actors through using their knowledge which they have over time evolved. Some of them have learned from areas they've lived before. They have seen what is happening in planned areas and accordingly tried to adapt that one. But this is not being used or it's not being introduced in the curricula in terms of training and of planners and building up cases for learning. This is really a challenge. This disregard of the society knowledge, especially the role being played by civil society and grassroots institutions in areas which are not planned, is a really big challenge because it's a lost opportunity to address urban inequality because they are doing a lot to address inequalities in formal settlements, but this is not yet recognized in training. Next, please. Food for thought. To wrap up, I'm only saying that decolonizing planning, education, and practice require acknowledgement of critical role the prevailing society knowledge is playing in the absence of proper planning. We are seeing actions and decisions being understood. We are seeing skills, we are seeing knowledge, we are seeing practices on the ground which are making a difference in terms of organizing communities, in terms of orderly organization, providing infrastructure, providing land for different community facilities, and introducing do's and don'ts in the informal settlements. In the absence of adequate planners, adequate planning, effective planning, these act as social players in the and the grassroots are playing a very important role. And this is something which is food for thought for us to think about. How can this be reconsidered in our argument to decolonialize plan education practice in the country? Two, addressing the interconnected complexities of social, economic, spatial, and institutional and political aspects of urban equality inevitably require multiple knowledge sources. This adds to the first point which I mentioned there, that it has been underscored by Adriana and Wesley also in their discussion about plan education. And I think this is really an important issue, which is also underlined in our NOW project, that unless we recognize and accept that knowledge cannot be only defined as those ideas and thinking which emanate from universities, from research institutions, but also knowledge is held by different people, different level and different contexts, and recognizing that it is actually the alloy of the two, of the all three or four, which can make a difference in the society, because particularly in a context where there are limited capacity and resources to have planners working at the different levels to support communities to transform their society and to address the issue of poverty and urban inequality, especially those ones which are apparent, like excessive density in some areas, lack of access roads and pathways for different facilities and services. This has been done already in some information by community on their own without planners, and this is something we ought to emulate. Move planning education, what you're arguing is that move plan education, training and learning outside the university to neighborhoods and municipal level. It's high time we start rethinking about planning, train of planners and learning outside the university as an area where we can generate knowledge that can make a difference, actionable knowledge that is already making a difference in the community. And this is where I think is another issue which we ought to think about. Acknowledge society knowledge cases, especially, as a key pathway to integrate users, communities in the development of curricula and training and training for urban inequality. What I'm arguing is that, again, I'm emphasizing the need for what we've uncovered in the society, in the NOW project, in our case of GOBA, where society knowledge has really proved and is increasingly showing that it can open up avenues for addressing urban inequality, especially social spatial inequalities, and even economic inequalities, which are arising from misuse and malfunction of land development. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kombe, for this really interesting overview on the one hand of the histories of planning education across several African countries and the many challenges that come with that, which, as you say on your last slide with the food for thought, are fundamental to redress if we want to recognize the many knowledges that already exist in the city beyond the academic knowledge, and to really think about building capacities of urban practitioners, to produce change on the ground, working in partnerships, especially with informal settlements. So thank you so much for that, and for also provoking us with some points for discussion later on. Our final speaker for this part of the session is Professor Edgar Peterson, who is the director of the African Center for Cities and the South African Research Chair in Urban Policy. His work on urban pedagogy and Southern urbanisms has shaped the development of the MPhil course in Southern urbanism, and his work in developing a curriculum for a new master's degree in Southern urbanism aims to create a pathway for a next generation of urban scholars from Africa, rooted in a post-colonial Southern perspective. Beyond UCT, Edgar Peterson teaches at the University of Stellenbosch, part of a ME in Sustainable Development offered by the School of Public Management and Planning and the Sustainability Institute, and he's also attached to the University of Cambridge Program for Sustainability Leadership. Welcome, Edgar.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here. So I want to use today, and I won't speak at the same level of, the same scale and level of abstraction and complexity as Prof. Levy and Kombe. I'll tell a very specific story, and that is about a new course that I tested out last year called The Art of Urban Regulation, which is a new component of our Masters in Southern Urbanism. But a little bit of context is probably called for. So ACC has been involved in this Global South research and curriculum agenda initially through the work of the Association of African Planning Schools that started a research project to review, but also to produce new kinds of postgraduate planning modules through a collective platform, which is the Association of African Planning Schools. That program ran from 2010 to 2016, and there's a whole bunch of open source materials that's available that begins to wrestle with the kinds of issues that Prof. Kombe has just spoken about. And of course, Ardhi University was very much part of that initiative. I'm not talking about that today. I want to reflect specifically on our Masters in Southern Urbanism that was initially came to life in 2016 in terms of the curriculum design process, and we had our first intake in 2018. Our academic years run as a normal calendar year from February to November. The Masters in Southern Urbanism is allied to a program based at the University of Basel called Critical Urbanism, and we share a chair across the two programs, and the students of that particular program spends one semester with our students doing some of the core modules of our master's program. And Professor Sophie Oldfield is the current incumbent holding these two programs together. We've just got national accreditation for a new master's program that we're hoping to launch this year. And so we've also been in the throes of curriculum design and development and wrestling over the last 2 years, sort of drawing quite heavily on the expert facilitation and insights of Gothenburg from IHS. And I'm not speaking about that either, but that may feed through some of the discussions that we'll have later. So this program is structured over 2 years. There's 3 core courses, that's essential, and then all of the students have to take a compulsory research studio. And the purpose of the studio is to explore the students to a plethora of methodological approaches to come to terms with the urban in all of its complexity. And to, if you will, move between a theoretical deconstruction of why there's a need for decolonization of the curriculum, of theory, of knowledge, of practice, and what that might mean if you take everyday urbanism seriously, but then with an eye of instantiating concrete interventions to translate normative frameworks that have been hard-won into routine practices of urban management, urban governance, and so forth. And so what I want to talk about is a new course called Curating Urban Regulation that we started last year. And I worked with a collection of ACC scholars and very closely with my colleague Nobu Ngwea, who co-taught the course with me and anchored the program. But it has to be understood in relation to the City Research Studio that we ran alongside this particular module. Now, this studio was focused on a very specific political moment in South Africa and Cape Town, which was a case where a social movement allied with an NGO challenged a regional government who sold a parcel of publicly owned land to a private developer. And the basis of the challenge was that in terms of the constitution and provisions in terms of the right to housing, that land, which is very well located in a prime tourism and sort of economic hub of the city, should have in the first instance be used for affordable public rental housing. They won that case after about 3 or 4 years of litigation and so forth. And so the judgment of that particular case paints a fascinating story about how does one bring radical claims to the fore, how does different kinds of social movement mobilizations coincide or coalesce or are curated to achieve very specific outcomes that can make a material difference. So in the studio, what we do is we focus on reading judgments as a way of reading the city, as a way of reading time, as a way of understanding the complexity of the various actors involved in urban processes and politics in particular. And in the studio, we invited all of these actors into the class, and the students had a 3-hour session with the developers, with the local authority, with the lawyers, with the NGOs and so on, to hear their perspective. And it's almost like one of those movies where you see the same set of activities happen from different perspectives. And then that was the basis of the studio. And they then had to imagine alternative timelines to retell that story at the end of the studio. Now that is why I kind of elaborated that will make a little bit sense, as I will now spend the rest of my time just talking about this course and the logics behind it. And in a way, what I'm not making explicit now, but that you should take as read, is that at the core of it is very much the kind of political economy questions that Caren had laid out so beautifully. But how does that translate into what does one do? How do you intervene in these complex, deeply historicized urban environments to both imagine but also instantiate alternative potential processes or outcomes? Now, the tenor of the course is very much this kind of, if you will, sort of provocation by James Ferguson from some time back now, where he lambasted us in the development studies world and in the urban studies world for being far too preoccupied with critique and to not spend enough time with thinking propositionally about what would be the alternative that we would instantiate if we win our claims. And, you know, that's a really fantastic short intervention, but it is deeply challenging and provocative. And it is kind of this reading that we take as a starting point on our journey for this course. Now, the reflections that I'm sharing with you would not have been possible with this class. That was sort of the guinea pigs, if you will, for this first iteration. And I just wanted to acknowledge both Nobu, but also the other members of this class who've kind of informed how to quite fundamentally rethink the course. I won't have too much time to talk about that today, but I'm happy to come back to it in discussion time and also a little bit about it just before I conclude. So I thought it's worth just reading out how the course is framed. It takes as a starting point the recognition that urban transformation is not necessarily just about getting the right policies in place, i.e. taking normative principles and ideals such as the right to housing or other socioeconomic rights enshrined in global and national covenants and implementing them at the urban scale. On the contrary, transformation is only possible if the subterranean codes and regulations that shape urban practice and norms are made visible, problematic, and in need for change. These regulatory codes infuse urban institutions, and they tend to have long and complicated histories. And again, Karen's exposition earlier is a beautiful example of what those histories look like, especially when colonial imperatives to exploit live at their origins. It goes on to say that the course is located at the intersection of literatures on governance, political opportunity spaces, system change, power dynamics, and the potential for experimentation labs to critique the status quo and specify concrete alternatives that can make a material difference, but also speak to diverse and conflicting constituencies that gravitate around any domain of public policy, whether it be mobility or housing or land or sanitation and so forth. And the way we've structured it was to have a set of conceptual anchoring and then a number of case studies at various scales, ranging from the global down to city level case studies, and then one that dealt with a national capacity building program aimed at the 8 metropolitan governments in South Africa, called the City Support Program. And the idea was to, if you will, naively, that the sort of key conceptual building blocks, which I'll walk you through in a moment, that comes from the conceptual anchoring in the first 4 sessions would then be carried through into these various case study explorations. And the case study explorations were all led by academic, scholar, activist types who were central to this particular sort of initiative that we're looking at, or is a deep expert in that particular topic. And then myself and Nobu fulfilled the function of, if you will, the sort of continuity announcers to connect these very specific cases that go deep on a context or an issue or a set of dynamics and try and relate it back. It was very complicated, and I'll come back to that, and sort of how one does that well is still something that eludes me. And then the last session was just a consolidation across these, which was open-ended with no readings, but just an opportunity for students to really bring all of the questions and uncertainties that they've collected over the term into that final session. Now, the next is just a sort of a sneak peek at some of the conceptual anchoring points. And I obviously can't elaborate any of these, and I'm happy to explore any of them. But really, the sort of at the heart of it is this idea that we are confronted by a really messy mongrel governance context, combined with wicked problems. And that what this course is trying to focus on is really how does one inhabit the distance or the gulf between these two things. And of course, this is a familiar story that is now very well established about relational governance, multiple actors, blah, blah, blah. And we all are very familiar with what characterizes a wicked problem. So the sort of what the students are encouraged to do, and if you will, the people who present the case studies, is to think across this chasm between normative ideals. And of course, this is the big temptation, right? Because we've now got the SDGs, we've got the urban SDGs, we've got the disaster frameworks, we've got this, that, and the other. There's 1,000,001 of these very progressive sounding things. But how does one think about that in relation to everyday governance dynamics, these mongrel dynamics, and then, of course, the intractability of these wicked problems in a context of low growth, a whole bunch of deep developmental constraining factors and so on. And of course, you can't. It's impossible. No one has got a brain big enough to solve that. But the insistence here is that through imaginative capacity, if one can strengthen that muscle, one can inhabit this chasm with intent and with a greater clarity, which of course, hopefully, if we're talking about planners, at least, will improve judgment, right? Because that is what we, I guess, talking about at the end of the day. So the sort of, where I started off was ideally this course should bring together critical theory, which have been developed in the first two modules of the master's as a whole, design thinking, but of a very specific dimension of that kind of sometimes deeply problematic field, and of course, systems thinking. Now, on the critical theory side, I'm not going to go through this. We cover all of these things in those first two modules, where I teach a course with another colleague on urban theory, Anna Zelmetsky, and we try and sort of grapple with this, and that's a story for another day, because it is really hard within the confines of a module to kind of build all of the armatures to be able to perform the kind of analysis we've just heard from the other two speakers on this panel. But you kind of get a flavor of what lives in that and so on. So we kind of just reconfirm this and take it as a starting point, but it's not the space within the course where we can really sort of delve into that. And then the key connecting concepts then that goes into thinking about design methods and systems thinking is power, political terrain landscape, actors, democratic atmospheres. And then here, of course, there's a focus on the different domains of urban politics and different kinds of actors, both in the formal and the informal sphere. And within this context, there's, of course, a sort of a whole set of practices which is deeply insurgent or partially insurgent and so on, and overlap with formal spheres and so on. So again, depending on the sort of democratic parameters of a given city or society, these dynamics will of course have very different parameters. We then use this particular now somewhat established framework by Gaventa on the Power Cube, which proved to be unbelievably helpful to get students to think about scale, about different kinds of political spaces and different kinds of power. It's still slippery, but at least, because you've got all these cases that unfold, there's an opportunity to continuously revisit this. And building fluency and capability in this one framework is really helpful for people to not sort of end up being overly ideological or overly critical or overly just about, sort of fixing the world through very practical interventions. It helps tremendously with that nuance. The institutional framework we draw on is very much is from a body of work on the waters of systems change, which again, this comes from the sort of more business management science and development studies kind of meeting together. But it proved unbelievably helpful for people to kind of understand when a problem framing sits at this level, or whether it's about the institutional dynamics within, and what does mental models or paradigm change actually means, and what the disjunctures are. So this will definitely feature again in 2.0, because this was just a very practical thing that made an enormous difference. And of course, it offers the opportunity to really demonstrate how the paradigm or mental model shift has to come from a systems thinking ontology and recognizing the importance of decoloniality. This is the sort of very typical design thinking process, which all of you are familiar with. And it assumes that design-driven problem solving is called for as the most generative approach to deliberative participatory planning and doing. And again, I'm happy to come back to that. I'm sure that's a deeply contested sort of claim there, but let's talk. And then one of the texts we work with is a very interesting application of that to a public sector context, where they kind of essentially conclude that the institutional constraints are too profound for design thinking to really kind of fulfill its province. And they end up with this idea of entrepreneurial hacks as a way of thinking through how does one deliver on very specific policies and so on. And I found that, again, a very generative sort of concept to help people to both work with just the sort of depth of inertia in public institutions in our context, and of course the possibilities of using new discourses, new fashions, new whatever technologies and so on to at least instantiate certain pockets of innovation or a sort of transformation within the public sector context. Now, sort of through using this, of course, it's important to continuously return to this belief that to effect both incremental and systemic change, it has to feed off strategic ruptures and moments of crisis. And therefore, you need the full democratic range of public passions and cultural attachments. In other words, we need to figure out a political grammar that can accommodate generosity, openness, rage, patience, experimentation, and impertinence. And what the studio did was to help us kind of really wrestle with the sensibility. So the City Research Studio sort of in-depth case over 6 weeks made it plain the importance of sustained protest and multidimensional imaginative politics of the street combined with the walls of power, because of course it was a judgment that delivered something to go through. So, so sort of everything always returns to trying to inculcate this sensibility, which is really, really difficult. So then to conclude, sort of this is the beginning of a reframing of the thinking, and to kind of put this idea of open innovation at the core of it. And part of that, and I'll be really blunt, is to try and sidestep some of the incredibly heavy and, in my view, sort of over invested in sort of conceptual armatures in urban planning and urban studies from the global south. It's often so much that the weight of that makes it very difficult for people to think imaginatively. And so I'm very interested in this idea of open innovation as a way of beginning to break through some of that encrustedness. Now, what are the lessons? The theoretical underpinnings of the course is complex and subtle. And, and it's hard to work out how much time to spend to consolidate that and how much time on the cases and how to do that, because the cases, of course, is led by leading practitioners in their field. And it's quite complex and tricky to kind of intervene in that pedagogic setting to do that knitting work. So, still uncertain about that. The policy narratives that underpin the case studies, they could be confirmed a lot more explicitly via the conceptual lenses. But of course, it's quite hard to ask seasoned professionals to kind of spend quite a bit of time working through that to do that. And again, so sort of how much of that sort of tighter integration does one achieve? And then in class, I found it really difficult to find the balance between critical engagement with the readings, with text, because of course that's an important skill, because people tend to veer into the weeds of the case study, right? So let's say we looked at it at minibus taxis and their regulation. You know, people can get really deep into the specificities of the case. And of course, students being students, you know, it's also a way of not engaging with the text because often people have not read all of the readings for the given day. And then, you know, as linked to that is how much room does one leave create for personal experience, given the tight architecture of the course. And again, people love to, because our students are from different countries, different contexts and so on, that you need to air that opportunity for people to talk about their context, because that's how the learning lands. But at the same time, it can also just be rabbit holes that, you know, sort of means you don't stay with the core learning of the day. So to conclude then, this is the emergence of what 2.0 will look like, and some of the anchorings between this that will sort of probably focus the cases for this year. But that's just started, and I want to thank you for the invitation, because it's really compelled me on the second day of working this year of what I'm going to teach in the second semester. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this series of really fascinating examples of, I think, curriculum, pedagogy, conceptual tools, diagrams, no? And that perspective of how to bring to the fore pluralistic perspectives and the unraveling of what you call the subterranean codes, the mongrel governance structures, in all that, you know, all that complexity, but without remaining in the diagnostic, as you said at the beginning, and really thinking about the imaginative muscle, the practical capacities, the sensibilities of the students. So I really want to invite everyone now to put their questions, if you haven't done so, in either the question and answer box or in the chat. And I will hand over the floor to Alan, who's our discussant in both of the sessions, to give very brief remarks now, and then perhaps a more fully fleshed comment at the end. So just to briefly introduce her, Adriana is Professor of Development Planning and Urban Sustainability at the DPU, where she founded and led for many years the research cluster on environmental justice, urbanization and resilience, and the MSc in Environment and Sustainable Development. Adriana is also the president of the Habitat International Coalition, and together with Aromar Revi, she's a lead co-investigator in the NO program's work on urban pedagogy. Adriana.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thanks to everyone. Pleasure to be here. As Julia said, what I will do is simply just highlight a few things of all the wonderful stuff that was put on the table to stimulate discussion, a few things that I think might be useful to get back to among all those provocations, not only back to the panel, but also back to everyone in the audience to stimulate the debate. So very much picking a few things again, and I will come back with further comments and reflections at the end of the second session. First, I want to thank Caren, Prof. Kombe, and Edgar for this beautiful and unrehearsed choreography. I know that you have all come up with your own thoughts without coordinating them, but I think that there is a beautiful level of complementarity in what you have put on the table. On the one hand, when I think about Karen's presentation, I think that, I mean, clearly she made a number of very important points, but I would like to remind us a first point, which is significantly important, is looking at and taking a stock of the very deep connection between what we call the crisis of planning and the crisis of planning education. And not to get bogged down on the connection between those two crises, but very much then to reevaluate the fact that planning education is a crucial domain to contest and to reimagine what planning does. So I think that that's a very important point that she highlighted. I think that overall as well, Caren gave us a very interesting map through the different dimensions and principles of what urban equality means and how we pursue it, to really plot the battles we pick up as pedagogues. And I think that, so the first invitation to everyone in the audience, but also to the panels, would be just to perhaps go back to a reflection on that, you know, from all these maps of, you know, again, planning, being applying education, having the capacity to be simultaneously a vehicle for maldistribution or redistribution, misrecognition or recognition, etc., what battles do we pick as pedagogues and why? I think that that's an important question, because clearly we don't go for everything. We go for certain things, sometimes intuitively, but I think that the reflection matters a lot. On the second, in the second presentation, Prof. Kombe again put many important issues and challenges on the table, but I want to go back to particularly two, perhaps, again inviting the audience to engage with this. One has to do with history, and how do we engage with history beyond description? How do we engage with history beyond saying, okay, this is somehow, you know, what happened before and got us here? How do we engage with history in a far more active way that we tend to do? And I think that this is very important. And I was looking at the questions and answers, and I think that Ruhamak, for instance, is saying, don't we have to look at longer histories than the colonial ones? And I think that, again, yeah, we can talk probably quite a lot about not only longer histories, but different histories and forgotten histories. I think that the three are quite important, no? Or hidden histories, if you wish. So again, an invitation to go to that. A second key point I thought that Prof. Kombe also brought to the table was the issue of the relationship between theory and practice. And it is, I think that this came up in the three in the three presentations, this idea that, of course, there is an ambition, usually when we talk about critical pedagogies, about the reinvention of applying education, to make some magic trick in linking, you know, better theory and practice. But I think that this, I mean, I would like to hear a bit more from the three of you in terms of, you know, how does this rearticulation or articulation between theory and practice look like in practice, I would say. So clearly what we can see very often, and I think that Edgar expanded significantly on this, is that we might have attempts to translate some theories into practice, very often developing an analytical muscle that sometimes even leads to analysis paralysis, no? To this idea of an overdeveloped critic muscle and the inability to really engage with practice. How do we just take then not just this as a one direction from theory to practice, but also from practice to theory through pedagogy? And I think that in the case of Edgar, again, I mean, many although he started from this beautiful statement of the beauty is on the street in your image, Edgar, I think that clearly the connection, there was a very deep connection with the previous points made, starting from the concrete, from a concrete pedagogic experimentation. In this case, what we saw was the city research studio being presented as a possible dispositive or device to connect, as in his own words, the urban, to make sense of the urban in its full complexity. And in that sense, I would like to invite, again, others in the audience, but also the other two panelists, to reflect when we look back at similar experimentations where we try to create pedagogic dispositives that do precisely that. Which ones, I mean, what makes them particularly productive in your view? I know that, I mean, Prof. Kombe, Caren, you have an enormous, you know, also and very long history of trying with such experimentation. And it would be really beautiful just to try to put our fingers on what are the key conditions, not the norms, but the key conditions that on reflection really make those pedagogic dispositives particularly productive, of course, in a progressive way. I stop here for now. And just to also acknowledge the very interesting question from Aruna. Aruna was asking about what are the other critical voices? Yeah, why are we all, or most of us from academia? And I think that there was an answer on that, but that's a very important question again, in terms of how are those voices and knowledges articulated in the reinvention of more progressive and transformative pedagogies. So I stop here, Juliet.
Thanks, Adriana. And I think I would like to play the ball straight back to our three panelists, our three speakers. And also, again, the questions in the question and answer box, perhaps to pick one of Adriana's remarks or key questions, and then also answer one of the questions that are in the box. Caren, please. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for that very clear set of issues to address. And in many ways, I feel that that the comment about, yes, how do we select our battles is very germane to what Edgar was talking about in terms of what they're trying to uncover in the studio. And for me also is very much linked to your question about what makes these kind of experiments, what makes them productive. But before I go on to that, I want to address the question about history. I'm absolutely passionate about history, and but at the same time, how do we make our understanding of history valuable to us in the present? And how do we use that history? And also, I think that using it in the present does mean uncovering those hidden histories as well, because you can never understand your present properly if you don't understand those hidden histories. But there's something that I really think is important, is not to romanticize history. History, just like the present, contains all the expressions of power relations that we see acting on the present. And so, for example, if I think about the question that Ruhuma has put into the chat, into the question and answer about looking beyond the colonial history to older Arab and Mughal histories, I think that's a wonderful endeavor and we can learn a lot from it. But let's not forget that that older history planning often happened in the image of the ruler, and that many of those cities were deeply structured by deep inequalities. So there's a huge amount to learn from those cities, and a huge amount to learn about urban life and urban ideas from those cities, no question about that. But they are not immune from the expressions of the top-down planning of the colonial era. They're not immune from the expressions of power and inequalities, which always confound us in this intersection between theory and practice. And so it seems to me that one of the things about responding to your relationship between theory and practice is, I don't believe that we can really practice if we don't understand the underlying biases in our practice ideas. We put our practice ideas into practice, and it's not surprising that we then have to deal with the consequences, which are often unpalatable, because we don't always explore the deeply embedded biases in those practices. And it's those kind of biases that are intrinsic to notions of order, to notions of social control, to notions of the public interest. All those notions that I talked about, which if we don't uncover them and we don't confront them, we're not going to change our practices. In other words, what I'm talking about here is fundamentally that need for reflexive practice in the way which we do practice. And that for me is how I bring theory into practice, is to just dig a bit deeper beyond the surface of the practice, to understand the ideological and the discursive relations that underlie everything we do. And we're not going to ever get beyond what we do if we don't get to grips with those underlying assumptions. my final point, I'm sorry, Juliet, to talk so long, but my final point, for me, one of the most fundamental conditions for a particularly productive working within the context of practice and within the context of something like a studio or a practice frame is to work in partnerships with equivalents, with the people on the ground. And I won't say more than that. It's a term that we use centrally in the way we work in the No program, and it's certainly been something that guided us throughout the work we've done in any kind of practice context. I think if you don't work in a direct way in partnerships with equivalents, which imply opening up to not only to questions of mutual respect and accountability between actors that one's working with in a practice context, but also recognizing the co-production of knowledge and the absolute imperative for co-learning in that relationship. We're not going to, there's no guarantee that that's going to be a very, very productive interaction in a studio learning context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caren, and apologies for being such a bad timekeeper. We might be going over a couple of minutes, but really want to make sure that we also have a break between the two sessions. Who would like to answer next? Prof. Kombe? Could you unmute, please?
Thank you, Julia. Caren has generally actually provided the answers to most of the questions and issues raised, but I have two observations. I want to add that on the issue of history, I don't think it will be very unfortunate if those of us from the global south think that planning education, planning theories developed in the West are not useful. Planning practices built in the West are non-starter. I don't think that is the right perspective. And I don't think we'll be very successful if we move from there. What I'm trying to emphasize is that history has its own place. Theories from the West have their own place, and they provide challenges and food for thought. And I think that is what has been missing among most of us who are looking at these issues, that we do not critically look at this and see what can be adapted, what can be used from this very long experience from the West, and which have led to this and this and this civilization in urban planning development. And therefore, how can these selected interventions be modified to fit our context? I think that's where I would see its relevance, and I would argue that my argument of society and knowledge being informing planning does not in any way downplay the very solid knowledge which is expert-based and which has a lot of underpinning theories and arguments and instruments which have been tested elsewhere. But the ground is now how practical are they in our context, and which is what planners and educators in the South ought to do. In terms of the interaction articulation between practice and theory, and I'll link that with what makes the experiments more successful, more relevant. My argument or my perspective understanding is that in our case at Ardhi, for example, Ardhi University, we've had planning school since the 70s. And our success in terms of training, especially when we look at job markets in the country, how fast are our planners getting jobs in the industry? What are the general public impressions and perceptions about planning and planners and graduates from other disciplines at the university, surveyors, land managers, engineers, and quantity surveying, and. The major idea which has framed our program is actually studio and real-life projects, which have been used in training and teaching. And these were built from the Scandinavian model, which built the program at Aro. They were funded by UNDP at the beginning, but then largely staffing from the Scandinavian, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and this had a very different approach to learning. The cases, studios were used very much to train and to inculcate knowledge. And where theory was called in, it was a reflective way of thinking. How does it reflect in practice? What elements have to be taken out of the theory, which can be applied in this specific, which ones are not applicable. Therefore, I would say that experience, lived experience, working in the studio, and engaging persons from the industry who have excelled in the discipline has been very important. Calling in some persons who have had experience of working being trained as professionals, going to the industry and working over years and making a lot of modification what they learned in the school, and sharing that with the students brings a lot of fertilization in terms of rethink among the students. Yes, this is what we learn, but when you go in the industry, expect change, and these are changes which you can modify and successfully make, and they can be accepted. Where cases are drawn by experienced person, bring to the class and arguing that this is what I learned when I was doing my studies, but when I went into the field, when I was working with the people, when I was working for the municipality or for the government, I did this and this and this. And they bought the idea, even though it was not built into the academic training and whatnot. Therefore, this idea of hybriding the training in collaboration with those in the industry who are working, who had a long experience, especially in working in a variety of contexts and projects, has brought in a lot of value in our courses and in our training. It has been, by the way, undermined by the inadequacy funding, where government are not ready to provide funding or for this kind of exchange, because they say these are things you are trained to teach the people, and these are people working there. If they want to share well, but you cannot pay them. And this want to be paid for the cost they put in to come and spend the time where they will have to show the student. Therefore, we have a problem there, which is, again, I've mentioned in my discussion about the role of institutions and how they can undermine or support pedagogy, training, planning, education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kombe. Edgar, perhaps also there's a final question in the last question in the question and answer, which is directed to you. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Yes, thanks, Adriana. I really enjoyed your distillation of some of the key issues for us to reflect on. I'll pick up on I guess just two things: the practice theory question, and then just sort of build on the Caren's point about history. So on the practice theory question, so for me, there's sort of a fundamental insight that, you know, one wants students to kind of arrive at in their own way. And that is this, sorry, this really, it's very difficult to sort of preempt it, but it has to be kind of discovered, if you will. And that is the difference between the kind of constellations that hold things in place, right? The way power is aggregated and its performance and its structures and its repertoires and symbolisms and so on, and what the alternative does. So it's not a mirror image, it's completely different things. And that is a very difficult thing for students to really understand if they don't have life and practice experience. And so in the context of the practice studio or whatever, you can't really get there, but you can kind of, if you will, suggest, intimate that this might be a discovery to be made. And the challenge is to I guess, you know, sort of curate that so that there's an understanding in a very embodied way that there's something I need to figure out when I'm in the world of practice. So to be less abstract, if you look at how things have changed over time, it's either an amazing person who's led a social movement or birthed a social movement, or it's something that's a complete surprise. And then the way these things then gets translated into effective political change are often very surprising and unusual coalitions of individuals, of personalities, of ideas, of moments, or whatever. They're highly contextual and they're deeply idiosyncratic. And this is the problem with critical theory, that often has such a strong belief in a very particular understanding of transformative change that's either class-driven or identity-based or whatever, that it is simply incapable of appreciating just the difference that such, if you will, almost idiosyncratic coming togethers can become. And so for me, that's what the practice studio is about deep discovery and about kind of an enticement into something that you just cannot have experienced because, you know, you're on the beginning of a journey, right? Now, practically from a sort of pedagogic perspective, for me, the very simplistic model is there's craft. So there's certain tools you need to learn. You need to know what the toolbox looks like at a minimum. And then there's science and scientific method, which is about data analytics, right? Which is about understanding the world. And this is what the academy affords, is the skills to learn those two things. But the difference gets made when you learn how to articulate that as what I would call an artful embracing of complexity. So there's a certain aesthetic, artistic capacity that cannot be taught almost, that is about a dialogical process of emergence or becoming, which is relational. So for me, the sort of this question of practice to theory has got to be rooted in that starting point in terms of how one curates it. Lots more to say about that. Let me make my final point. History. I completely agree, Caren, with your points and the questions from the audience and so on. But I want to make a plea for kind of holding history and futures together, right? Because we are right in the midst of some unprecedented emergences of dynamics that we just cannot understand because of their speed and their complexity and their variability across scale and across territory and so on. And so for me, it's about not so much the label history of futures, but it's about appreciating the intersections of speed, scale, distribution, and institutional forms. So how do these things manifest at different points in time, right? That's the question. Because if you're not able to understand the enormous variety and variability of institutional forms, it is very difficult to make sense of them historically or in terms of future potentialities, right? I'll not say more about that. I'll just leave that as a weird point to end on. And then very practically on that question, because I'm going to rework the course quite a bit, I'm very happy to share that, but not in a public way. So whoever the anonymous person was who asked, they can anonymously email me and I will not so anonymously share with them the draft curriculum. Happy to do that. But yeah, thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all the speakers. As you said, there is a lot more to say and to think about and to discuss. But I think we have to break for 20 minutes. And then we'll get together for the second part of the series. Neha?
Yes, I'd like to request all the panelists to come back at 6:30. And for the audience, we'll give a little bit extra time for just those who are speaking in the second session to come back at 6:30 India time for a tech check. And then we'll see everyone back at 6:35 in the audience. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We'll start in just a couple of minutes. In the meanwhile, I just want to check with our four panelists for the second session if they would like to do a quick tech check, if they have slides that they would like to share. If not, we'll start in about 5 minutes. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the second of our panels for today's plenary session. I'd like to invite Yulia to introduce our panelists for the second half.
Thank you, Neha, and welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. We're going to start the second part of the session with Professor Darshini Mahadevia, who is Associate Dean at the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. She's a well-known scholar whose research focuses on equity concerns with urban policies relating to climate change adaptation and mitigation and human and general development. Prior to her role at Ahmedabad University, she coordinated the Center for Urban Equity and was the Dean of the Faculty of Planning at CEPT University. Her teaching currently includes courses on urban finance, cities, SDGs and climate change, urban governance and development theories. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I didn't know I was the first speaker. Is my voice clear?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I'm an odd person out among the group that is here, was working in planning school and urban studies programs. But I think, and I agree with a few of the statements made in the previous session. Professor Kombe, in his presentation, had written, moving planning education outside from the planning schools. And that's, I'm going to speak a bit about my own experience in this context and then say what needs to be done or how do we go about it. And I'm going to be speaking very much contextually about the Indian experience. I'm really happy that this conversation has started in India. It's been there for some time. But more structurally, as IHS is taking our leadership in this discussion, and we hope to continue this discussion in Indian context, because this is an idea whose time has come in India for now. Before I go and speak about the various possibilities of bringing the city to the schools or the programs that we are running, and the real city, I want to preface that by, the experience we have here in Indian context is there are certain structural issues that limit this possibility. I'm going to firstly speak about that because this really far deeper understanding is required on the way forward about how we bring in the issue of urban equality or urban equity within the school. This term equality has been turned on its head in India because of various affirmative action policies that we have practiced now since the Indian Constitution was put in place. That's been challenged today by using the term equality. And so they said, for example, there's a forum called Doctors for Equality, which is actually challenging the affirmative action rather than thinking about equality. So I think the arguments in Indian context will need to be further more nuanced when we talk about equality. There's also another, and there's a sort of a major structural limitation is that the pendulum on policy rhetoric has actually shifted extremely to the ultra-right positions today. And so all the notions of equality that are enshrined in Indian Constitution have been turned on their head to actually deny options for those who have been left out of various kinds of entitlements, including within the city context. The second issue is that we've been teaching in planning school now for more than 25 years, and it is dependent on individual faculty's orientation to bring the issue of urban equity within the program through a few theory courses, but largely through the studios, because we all know that in cities of the global south, the inequality, the informality, various degraded areas, etc., do stare you in your face. So when you go into the field for a studio work, you do see this, and you bring this analysis, this data into the studio. However, then as we move forward, is when you start thinking about the solutions to how this needs to be addressed. That's where you hit into a structural wall. So either you deal with what is called formal planning mechanism, and I'm going to come a little bit to it very soon, or else you run into the wall of various regulatory mechanisms which are in place. And I don't need to sort of discuss here and elaborate on how plans exclude. I think Vanessa has written about it, and many others on this sort of panel also have written about it. So I don't want to elaborate on it, but we know that the current planning tool that we have is, you do run into a wall where you were not able to find answer. For example, the current, and I think I see Gautam, or I saw him on the list of participants. So there's this exercise going on in Delhi about bottom-up construction. Bottom-up construction of, sorry, I think somebody's calling. The bottom-up construction of how urban planning or master plan should be. But I wonder, because what the proposal in the plan is to just use market mechanism to solve all kinds of problems in the city. And so we do run into very legalistic statist planning frameworks, even if there was an idea of innovations, as I think Edgar used the term, of innovative solutions to the city being thought of in the planning studios. The third sort of limitation or structural limitation is that a lot of planning education in Indian context have moved into the private education domain. And so when you get the students into the studio or into the school or into the program, they are more inclined towards dealing with skills and acquiring skills to fit into the current market practice. There is this idea of how marketable the course is and how marketable the program is. And it then sort of leads to a situation wherein the students think about how they're going to fit into the practice rather than attempting to influence the practice as we go forward. Therefore, we need to deal with bringing the city or the real city into the planning practice in a very different way. I see a hope in new educational institutions and universities coming up in India, which are more liberal education universities. This is a new trend that we see. We see it's here that we could sort of put in programs which are city practice program, urban practice programs, as we would rather. I think I like the term that IIHS is using, or even Edgar has used that term for the new program that they have developed to deal with urban practice. Basically, weave in bottom-up solutions, which she calls design solutions, and bring these new exercises or experiments, which are innovative educational experiments out of the planning schools into other universities and programs which are upcoming. I like to share briefly about the exercise that I'm in Ahmedabad University. We are in the third year of our program, so extremely infant in our existence in terms of the new programs that we have developed. But what we are asking our students to pick up, so we've designed at an entry level certain foundation program, and one of the foundation program is a neighborhood studio. And that is an interesting element because it's at the neighborhood level you start investigating your city. We're based in Ahmedabad, so we've taken Ahmedabad as our example of engaging with the city. And in other studios that we deal with issues of democracy and justice, environment and climate change. The entire knowledge domain that we would want our students to engage with and then look at the neighborhood or the city through this lens and start interacting with the city in the studio. The experience, so we've done a little bit of work on COVID, but the experience is new because we did one semester of it and then we ran into COVID. But we see this as a possibility. There are other options possible within our university is to deal with very much, I like Edgar's presentation very much because it sort of resonates very well with the way forward we are thinking about is to set up Ahmedabad Design Lab that starts sort of weaving in solutions, applying design approach. And it could be very much everyday solutions of the city with which either one engages at the neighborhood level or through our cities. Ahmedabad lab that we are putting up. So I do see, but I'm finding it extremely difficult to think of possibility that urban planning programs would change. I've done a review of the planning curriculums in Indian planning schools. And what I find is that, every time a new idea comes up, they put it in the curriculum. And so it's always topping it up with not foregoing that all the sort of traditional curriculum of spatial planning, or not just spatial planning, but dealing with master plans and development plans. And if you review the development plans or spatial plans, which are prepared now, this is another exercise I'm doing with a colleague of mine. I mean, they're so vacuous. One just wonders why they have been written up. And we've been doing this for 50 years, preparing these documents, preparing students to do these documents, which have extremely poor data. There's absolutely no data. We just check all the master plans, except the last master plan of Delhi. All other master plans you pick up, there's just no data. There's no evidence-based planning illustrated in this document. And finally, now we have reached this market approach. So this market decides how through TDR and FSI, etc., the cities are going to shape themselves in a patchwork way. So there is very little hope to be able to reach the agenda of equity through the existing planning practices. And the planning practices and planning education being privatized, the planning practices then, the education follows the practice, not the practice influenced by new ideas coming out of educational institutions. And so we think probably we have to get out and start, and I suppose that's why new programs that have come up who deal with urban areas and urban practice don't call themselves planning schools. So thank you. I end and may be happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure that there will be a roll of questions coming in. If you've just joined us, please feel free to put in your questions at any time in either the question and answer box or also in the chat, and we're going to monitor that and pick them up after the 3 presentations. So I would like to go now to Jorge Pena Diaz and Joiselen Cazanave Macías from the Instituto Superior Politécnico José Antonio Echeverria in Havana, the CUJAE. Jorge leads the Urban Research and Action Group at CUJAE, where he has taught and researched since '95, and he leads and his academic work has evolved from Cuba in an intensive exchange with a wide international network, including lecturing at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, ETH Zurich, UCL, and University of Toronto. He has collaborated on many international research projects on planning processes and practices, including where he is the city lead for Havana together with Joiselen. And Joiselen is Professor of Urban and Architectural Design and the Dean of the Havana School of Architecture at CUJAE. She holds a doctorate in technical science from CUJAE and is also part of the Urban Research and Action Group there. So welcome to both of you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for us to join you today from Havana. We are going to make a presentation that was actually made by the two of us, but in order to make a better use of the time, I'm going to make the presentation myself, and Joyce is going to be supporting here. And at the end, if there are any questions and so on, we can make it together. So now I'm going to share the screen.
So.
Sorry, we're trying to share the screen now.
If there is an issue with sharing the screen, perhaps could you send the presentation to Neha so she could share it from there? And we can also perhaps switch the presentation and start with arrows first, if that would be okay with you.
Well, I think it's faster if we send the presentation.
Yeah. And in the meanwhile, perhaps I can go to Aro and then come back to your presentation. So, Aro, I hope you're there. I don't think you need a lot of introduction in this group, but I'm just going to have a very brief introduction anyway to say that Aromar Revi, he's the founding director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and he's also co-lead investigator for NO's work package on multiplying translocal learning in higher education. He has over 30 years of interdisciplinary experience in public policy and governance, the political economy of reform, development, technology, sustainability, and human settlements. Aro is also a member of the Leadership Council of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and co-chair of its urban thematic group, where he led a global campaign for an urban SDG. So Aro, if you're there, then the floor is all yours.
Thanks, I was just unmuting myself. I'm going to share screen and hopefully we'll see something interesting here. Good, can you see the screen?
Still loading on my side. Now I can see it, yeah.
Good. So I'm just going to represent in some senses a lot of work that my colleagues have done over the last few. We have a little bit of, yeah. So I'm going to just go over very quickly work that we've done over the last, specifically the last 5 years, but actually the last 10 years or so. And, you know, I'm filling in for my colleagues who've done this work. Basically, I'm going to look at the Urban Fellows Program, which is now more than 5 years old. And in a sense, has tested a whole range of questions that we've been sort of struggling with or looking at over the last decade or so. So that's kind of an image in the middle of COVID. You can see we managed, unlike most other programs in India, to actually teach continuously through that process. So let me take you back a little bit. This is a bit of sort of IHS's journey in the pedagogic space. We started working on this thing more than 10 years ago. So I'll start with the curriculum framework for the Masters in Urban Practice, which is a very interesting experiment and sort of underpins a lot of what we've done and what we're talking about just now. So I guess the first question we had, of course, was what is the goal that we're looking out for? The goal was basically to educate a large number of people to enable systemic change. And, very consciously, we chose not to go either for a planning program or for a debate that we a number of people on this call are on that debate, for a planning plus program in some senses. So the idea was to educate people who bring together a whole range of processes in the urban space to enable systemic change. And we asked a very simple question about, 12 years ago. And the question was, what does a young person need to know to help transform urban India by 2030? This was a directed question. We knew that it would take time for people to come in and start transforming the system. We know that most of us were more part of the problem than part of the solution in some senses. So in some ways, we were looking at young people trying to enable this change. And when we developed this curricular frame, which is a very open question, we brought together 200 people from across the world to help answer it. And like I said, many people were on this call, were part of this, on this conference, or part of this process. And out of that emerged, I would say, 5 sort of core principles. The first thing is, if you want to really try and enable systemic change, you do have to transgress disciplines. And planning is, is an area of practice and pedagogical engagement that does that in many ways. But at least the kind of planning practices that we have in education, like Darshini was just saying just now in India, has been, deeply challenging, and it's neither got scale nor has it sort of got relevance, and it doesn't deal with some of the core questions that we had. So the first question, which is I think a very deep question at that point of time, was, can you actually run and build an interdisciplinary curricular framework? Can you build a program that can do this? And we chose very consciously neither to look at, typically syllabi. That's what we do in many parts of the world. So you develop a syllabus is locked down. And if you've gone through that syllabus in lockstep, then you get a degree or you're allowed to practice in that particular field. That seemed like a really bad thing to do. Then the other question was, okay, if you don't have a syllabus, then can you build a curriculum? And we said, even that is not a good thing to do for 2 reasons. The first thing is a curriculum locks you down in particular space and time. And the second thing, at least in our context, was much of the knowledges that were being transmitted in India, and that's true, I guess, in many parts of the global South, come from other places and other contexts. So in effect, you want to enable knowledge to be created in your own context. And we've heard a lot of that today. And especially if you're trying to engage with questions of equality, it just doesn't work to be able to take knowledges that even in a large country like us come from other contexts, because context-driven solutions are very important. The second question, of course, was bridging the so-called theory-praxis binary to keep with, in a sense, the theme of this conference here. Is it possible to do that? Is it possible to build theory out of praxis? What's the value of theory in an educational program vis-a-vis praxis, etc. And we took a very strong position on this, and I think it's played itself out quite interestingly, and that is that we need to try and bring this together. We need to bridge this, and I think we've made some decent progress in that. The third thing, of course, is you really can't effect large systemic change without being inclusive, especially in a subcontinental context as far as we're concerned, and inclusion has many dimensions to it. Across identity, across different forms of knowledges, and also ways of knowing. So that was another core question. And this ties very closely to the sort of agenda that we've been exploring and know over the last few years, etc. And then a great debate that we had when we were developing the curriculum, that is, what's a value framework that we'd work with? So universities, especially universities in a wider international frame, talk about universal values. And after a long debate and some engagement, what we focused as far as India was concerned was to go with core constitutional values. That's something that's in deep debate at the moment in India, and each society as it changes will go through these questions. But we took a very clear position on that, saying that the constitutional values should sort of underpin the processes, the knowledges you create, the kind of practice you're engaged with. And, fortunately or not, we have a very wide frame, which I think is somewhat deeper in some senses, at least in our context, than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the other way that you can look at this if you embrace sort of universalist things. And then, of course, the final question is, can you scale? So these were, these were design principles or that we used to try and deal with this question. So, of course, there are many things that happened. And I think one of the most interesting things happened was that our regulatory frame didn't allow us to scale because they believed that some of the work that we're doing was kind of less or more interesting that should be done. So we were not able to build the program that we wanted to build, and that's sort of work in progress. But instead, we went on to something else. But I will take you to 3 core ideas again to go beyond the idea of binaries. It's a triptych in some senses. Each of them has 3 different elements. As far as the curriculum is concerned, there were three elements that were actually central to what we sort of co-created over about 2 or 3 years. The first, which is quite important at least in the Indian context, is what we call the core curriculum, which in a sense is sort of explicates some of the debates that have been happening here over the last 100 or more years. And that's the image on the right, which basically is how do you actually help the integration between the head, hand, and the heart. That's, you know, the essence of what Gandhi tried to put together in his curriculum that they built in the 1930s called Nayi Talim. That was an essence of some of the things that Tagore put together when he created one of India's greatest universities, which unfortunately is not in a very good shape just now, which is called Vishwabharati, to try and do that. So how do you bring this together? Because when you're dealing with urban practice and you're dealing with education in a wider sense, the learning journey towards mastery and engaging with wicked problems, that connection is very important. So the core is about that. We have not done as much as we would have liked to in that space, but I think that's foundational in some senses. That's what connects the movements and the processes and the struggles that we see with the city with those of us who are engaging with it in other forms and ways. And then the other question was, okay, how do you bring all this interdisciplinary knowledge across, you know, 20 or 30 or 40 different disciplinary areas together? Because when you're dealing with real life and problem solving, especially with dealing with wicked problems, you need to bring them together. So, you know, we call that, for better or for worse, the commons, because that's the thing that brings together multiple disciplines. There was a whole range of, you know, things that we did to put that together. And then finally, of course, you can have interdisciplinary engagement, but you do have to go out and do some things in the real world and connect with real processes. And we did that, which we, you know, in a sense, tied into the institutional frame that we put together by looking at core problematics, looking at governance, looking at economic development, looking at human development, looking at environment and sustainability. And we organized concentrations that enabled at least the curricular frame to be able to integrate and bring together disciplines to address these questions. Because, you know, young people who went out and have done things in the world, they need to actually engage with the world as it's currently constructed. So those are the three elements that we're talking about: the core, the commons, and the concentration. It's a sort of, it's a new vocabulary in some senses. And maybe, you know, it seems a little bit odd to people who don't work in this way, but it actually has worked with us. The other question, of course, was how do you negotiate the learning journey, which is the image on the on the left. And I've sort of simplified it. It's a little bit more complex than that, but just for the sake of argument. And that is, how do we go from where most education, at least in our environment, works on, which is if you're able to give you know, a solid foundation in terms of skills and some knowledges, especially disciplinary knowledges. The core thing that most really good programs in India deal with is provide you criticality. It allows you to critically examine facts and evidences, and then you can move forward from that into, you know, practicing in other places. But very often the process of practice is actually learned on the job. It's rarely enabled inside the educational environment because there's a belief that you might contaminate education by actually engaging it with practice. Is almost a sort of, you know, I would say a very strong belief in that space. The challenge for us is to move from criticality to proposition. And I think that's part of the very important learning journey that is part of the Urban Fellows program, and it will be part of the Masters in Urban Practice program, which is a 2-year program, which sort of picks it up and runs with it. So shifting from criticality to proposition or enabling the connection is very important. And it's also part of bringing together people from very, very diverse backgrounds, from multiple disciplines, and enabling them to co-construct, to co-create responses to critical questions, including how does one deal with questions of equality at scale in very different kind of environments. But eventually, if you have to bring these reflective practitioners into the world and allow them to do stuff, the key thing is enabling agency. And, you know, that often only happens when you encounter things that are quite different, and that happens in practices. The question is, how can you bring that that experience, at least, of limited agency or more of it, as you think, into the curricular frame? So I thought I'd just lay this out. You know, the three elements of trying to work the integration, which is very challenging and difficult. For us, that will happen much more clearly as we build up in our, you know, on our own campus and programs, as it becomes more concrete. The sort of learning journey, which starts with criticality, goes on to proposition, then goes to agency. And the agency itself has to be critical, because unless it's able to then examine its own products and its processes and its own contradictions, it will actually not move forward in some senses. So this is, I would say, 4 sort of core elements of the frame that we have. So what we did was to adapt the IHS curriculum framework, and you can see it here, the commons term, the elective term, which is building on the concentrations, and then, of course, internship when you actually engage. This is a 9-month program. And what you can see over time here is how this program actually has sort of evolved and how we've played with things, especially in the COVID period when we've had to adapt, even though we are teaching face-to-face in a blended format. So this has actually taken a digital pivot. The core thing in this is that what we learned from this is 5 years of experimentation shows that the framework is flexible enough to hold and allow experimentation, which is very important, because I think what we've learned is that if you don't have a frame that's flexible enough, if you don't sort of draw in the winds from all 4 quarters, you'd actually not be able to respond to the current reality, whether it's COVID at one end or a changing socio-political reality as far as that's concerned. So you need to change and adjust constantly. Of course, the challenge in that when you're running a program is if you change too quickly, you don't actually, you can't actually measure what's happening, and it's difficult to manage that. But all that I'm saying here is this framework has worked, and we've sort of broken it down in particular ways. We don't have time to go into them in detail, but we're happy to share that experience separately with you over time. So what are the core pedagogic elements and the learning journey? In the commons term, we try and do 4 or 5 things. The first thing is to build a core vocabulary across the urban. We have people who come in who are sociologists. We have people who come in at the other end who are technical people, engineers who have very little understanding of the social sciences. You have to get them to understand and appreciate the range of different knowledges, vocabularies, and the canons that exist, and also help them to sort of co-create. And the way that we do that effectively is really by using, as we've heard earlier, the practica as a basis of trying to do this, to bring it together in practical everyday engagement, which literally starts from day 2. So you diagnose, you analyze, you interconnect, which is part of the criticality question. You build core skills, because there are a whole range of skills that are not part of formal programs. You absolutely learn from place, because I think that's the important thing that urban programs bring. They take context, they take knowledges, and they embed them in place. So that's the first term, which runs over 4 months or so. And then you go in to try and engage once you've sort of deconstructed and brought things together in the elective term around particular sets of knowledges which people are able to choose from. So you deepen the analysis, you acquire specific knowledge sets which are relevant to what you're doing. If you're working on infrastructure and systems, it's somewhat different from dealing with governance. You frame practices and propositions in real context. You deepen your technical skills. And of course, you learn from experimentation. And then in the internship, you test, you apply, you translate, you reflect in a real world context. In the elective term, of course, we provide them real projects that allow this process to work. This is a 9-month sort of consolidated view of what would actually happen over 2 years. And we have the same frame that hopefully, as we get to build our undergraduate program at some point in time, would actually happen over 4 years. And in some senses, we would be different, because you have to build disciplinary skills, and an undergraduate program is not only about interdisciplinary engagement, but across a whole range of things. So the commons as we have it just now has 7 different elements, and you can see them. There's an engagement on infrastructure and services, an engagement on built environment and planning, there's an engagement on the urban economy, there's an engagement on urban sustainability, on law, governance, and policy, and identity and social practice. And we've developed ways of trying to engage with this as 6 sort of 6 parallel layers. And the thing that brings it together is the practica. So what we've learned in the last 5 years is the fundamentals of the curriculum frame actually hold. The commons as an interdisciplinary foundation works and sort of remains in spite of the fact that we have adapted and changed it over time as we teach and we reflect. And as far as the concentrations are concerned, we did in a particular imagination sort of look at them as 7 or 8 different things. They've morphed and changed over time, and you can see there are 4 broad sets of buckets that we deal with here. There's sectoral engagement in terms of the modules. There's thematic engagement in a whole range of thematic sort of organized principles as far as that's concerned. There's a strong basis in terms of theory, especially Southern urban theory, but also theory around other things, including film, around integrating, looking at as a place, as a way of organizing stuff, and of course, a whole range of technical skills that we try and. So there's a interesting morphing that's there, and there's been a debate between us and an engagement with the African Center of Cities, and Edgar mentioned part of that interesting cross-regional debate that we've had, and to try and see how we can support and sort of co-create in different environments. Now, to kind of wrap up here, I think one of the most important things that we've learned is really the power of inclusion and the the importance of curating within quotes the right class. And what we've learned is it's not only about the values that you hold. In India, public universities have to do this as a matter of statutory requirement. We're not required to do this, but we did this as something that we thought was really important to our transformative agenda, especially around questions of equality. But what we've learned is that interdisciplinary learning is not possible without a diverse class environment. So we went in with a huge assumption in the beginning, and that was that nobody really actually knew when we started 10 or 12 years ago whether interdisciplinary teaching and learning in this kind of somewhat radical format would actually work. I mean, people had tried that in a few places here and there, but not at this scale. But what we learned very quickly was that interdisciplinary teaching and learning is not possible without a diversity. And diversity around two counts: diversity of discipline and diversity of life worlds. And that, I think, has really been an important thing. It was, we started with something that was a good thing to do, and we discovered very quickly that peer learning is so important and engagement with people's life experience is so important. You really can't do that. So one of the important things we've learned how to do, and one of India's top universities did this for many years, JNU, they had a program that did this, was the admissions process awards diversity points on this thing. So you curate the admission process to be able to enable this to happen. And I think as an outcome, it's been only 5 years, but we've done pretty well on this. We've built a very useful analytical frame to do this. And I think we have pretty good high degrees of representation. Anywhere between 30 and 45% of our classes actually are representative across all of these things around caste, which is very important in India. Gender, of course, we have, we have a challenge in our case. 60% of our class are women, which is we're very proud of. We have to actually do inverse gender reversal as far as that's concerned. About a third of our classes are first generation learners. And of course, a lot of them come from non-metropolitan areas. So we're curating for that very actively. The other thing that we've done very consciously, because we draw from 9 different disciplinary clusters, is that no single disciplinary cluster can make up more than 30% of the class. So there's an analytical frame to do this. We've learned how to do this, and we're happy to share this with other people who may want to do this thing. So we're not only doing this for inclusion, but this actually is the most important thing that we've learned that actually enables excellence, because if you measure excellence in a wider frame, you get a whole different set of results as far as that's concerned. So this, I think, is an important thing that we've been able to do, and we're happy to share this with other people. I'll just close with 2 more slides here. This is a book that will hopefully come out in the next few months. And I said I'm standing in for my colleagues who are writing it at the moment. It describes, in a sense, what we've done. So you can see here, why we started to do what we do, but very much, and I've given you a very quick overview of it, what we teach, what are the elements that we teach with, the practica, the skills and methods and projects, what do the faculty learn about this process, what do the fellows learn? So we've actually gone through and picked up on that. And of course, critical things that we don't often talk about is how do we curate a class for this program, and how does a program like this actually run? And we've, building on the inspiration, the work of No, we've been really privileged to actually track post-UF trajectories. So we actually have some evidence on this and have people reflecting on the process and with some evidence. So this is a new book which should be out as one of the great outcomes, I would say, of the No process, which look at this question. And then finally, a few sort of quick reflections before I close down. So what are the core insights that we have? The first one, of course, is that you can teach it. You can teach interdisciplinary engagement at this point. We never knew this was possible 10 years ago, excepting for friends and colleagues who've done this thing in other places, but this certainly can be done. We're sure of this just now. The second thing is that you can bridge theory and practice. You can do that in very pragmatic and practical ways. We have an advantage because we have a very large practice program that is doing this at scale in terms of numbers across, as Edgar talked about, across the Park Cube in some senses. That helps because the faculty members are engaged with that. You can deal with inclusion, at least at the scale that we're working on. When we get into the hundreds or maybe the thousands, we may have some other challenges. There are deep questions about values, which are deeply contested, especially societies and educational processes change. What we haven't been able to do, at least in this program, we do scale and other things, is actually take this at scale. We should have been at least at the hundreds at the moment. We are still, in the thousands at the moment, we're still at the hundreds. So that's one thing that we've still not been able to do. So we're hoping that at some point of time, pretty quickly in the future, we'll have the ability to build it out. But we have the capacity to do that. So what has made this possible? And this is something that's I think some people have shared with, and I would say 5 things. The first thing is systemic change can happen. We didn't know that, and I think we have pretty good evidence of that happening. certainly on the practice and a whole range of other sides. It takes time to make this happen. We were quite eager to make this happen very quickly because, you know, there's so much need for this to happen. To get people out who can build institutions and actually make change on the ground, you have to be very, very much more patient than we were when we started. So you have to have deep patience to make it happen. You have to have the willingness to invest massively in the future. It's not easy to do this kind of thing. And I said the most significant investment is time and energy. You know, money and resources are subsidiary as far as this is concerned. You need to have a deep and clear strategy on the curriculum, on a whole range of other things. It has to be situated in a process. And of course, it has to be executed impeccably, which means that a whole range of other people need to be involved and other partners to co-create this. It cannot be done by academics or practitioners or administrators on their own. And most important, you have to bring remarkable people into the process who have the heart to stay the course, because this is a tough and long journey. All of us who've been part of struggles in various parts of the world know that. These are changes that happen over a generation, if not more. And especially when we're talking about questions of equality and bridging the gap between theory and practice and transgressing disciplines. This is a long journey. It's not a short one. So I'll stop there, and hopefully I'm eager to hear what Jorge and other colleagues are saying from Havana. They've really inspired us. So back to them.
Thank you so much, Aro, for sharing that really remarkable story. And I think there's so many elements that we can unpack. But yes, I hope Joyce and Jorge are still with us, and I think their presentation has arrived as well, right? So I'm going to hand over to them.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Can you tell us please if you're
now we
seeing
can see
our screen?
Yes.
You can see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So again, we apologize for the interruption. Unfortunately, there was a technical problem sometimes, you know, it's tricky. And so we are going to make a presentation that has its focus on the very special urban situation we have in Havana and how it connects, how it interrelates with the development of a postgraduate program, and also how it is interconnected with the development that is taking place in the undergraduate program. So it's an interconnection between urban situation, undergraduate, and postgraduate programs in order to tackle the very special situation on the urban. So Cuba and Havana has been through a very special urban situation. We defend the idea that we are somehow entering into a new stage of the urban process, and this is characterized by significant structural changes that are affecting the urban situation. In general, for example, there is an increase in the participation in the economic dynamics of non-state, non-public actors, as well as a remarkable focus on prosperity. This, of course, has put pressure onto inequalities. So there is an increase of inequalities. There is also a deepening of the challenges of linked to reciprocal recognition. There is also a strengthening of the narrative linked to the participation of a multiplicity of actors, as well as even thought there is a recognition of a need of more participation. This actually is not taking place in an effective way in the urban reality. So all of this is in the context of the strengthening of the U.S. blockade against Cuba, particularly during the Trump administration. There was a very difficult situation, we could say. And Biden has not changed it. And this is important in order to understand that the transformations that are taking in the urban and also in the curricula are pretty much framed by these conditions. At the same time, there has been a recognition that prosperity has to be achieved regardless this external factor, and also the fact that the equality has to, or approaches towards equality have to evolve as well. So there we can recognize that there is a tension between these forces that are looking for prosperity and also the attempt to keep a focus on equality. There are, for example, interesting nuances. For example, the fact that there is a distinction in the use of some terms. For example, igualdad, which could be translated into English as equality, is more used into the realm of recognition, participation, and care, whereas equidad, which means equity in a way, is pretty much direct with distribution and access. All of this is to be seen in the context of the fact that Havana faces a unique urban situation. For example, it has had a very small population growth during the last 60 years. The city has not expanded and has been rather contained, and there is an absence of sprawl. CUJAE and Havana also has a very low motorization rate, which is pretty much connected to the previous situation. And this has allowed, for example, for an appropriation of the public realm by pedestrians and people in the streets. At the same time, it has managed to preserve its historical structures, and there is a very interesting diversity of urban patterns, which indicates also a diversity of forms of inhabiting the city. And what is also interesting is the urban management, the urban handling. Is, for example, we can see that there is a democratization of properties. So most Cuban households are the owners of their houses, and we are allowed to have only one property per person, which significantly shrinks and affects the dynamics of the real estate market, which is starting. There is an emergent situation, but it's not in control of the urban dynamics. There is a prevalence of public ownership of land, and as a matter of fact, more than 90% of the urban land is public. And it's interesting to acknowledge that there has not been evictions, for example, which has been a problem all over the world during the pandemic context. We have not had any eviction in Cuba. Of course, this is pretty much related to the previous condition. But at the same time, Havana faces the very same challenges that most of the large cities of the South are facing. For example, the impact of climate change and the struggles for more urban resilience, the challenges that are associated with the preservation of this conserved urban heritage, but also the struggling in order to cope with the housing demands, the impact of tourism in the urban identity, pretty much affected by the global forces, sometimes colonial views that is bringing in the kind of milieu that are expected to be created for tourism. The same is true also regarding food security. Cuba has enormous depth in terms of securing self-sufficiency in terms of food, and this has been pretty much visible during the pandemics and also previously, for example, affecting this dimension of urban equality related to distribution. So we have been seeing enormous queues for food during the pandemics, but also during the pandemic and also previously regarding transportation. Even though Cuba has a long tradition of focus and priority towards healthcare, At the same time, there are tensions that are related, for example, with the fact that we have an aging population, and this puts forward additional demands. Party political participation has been temporal, spatially, and methodologically discontinuous, and therefore there is a lot to do in this area. And at the same time, this new stage is showing that there is a deepening in the understanding of these challenges linked to reciprocal recognition. And we have seen, for example, very interesting debates related to the approval of a new families code, also a national commission against racism, against women violence, and also the recognition of the weak and vulnerable situation of internal market. So all of this, of course, is having an impact in the debates on the urban condition and showing contradictions regarding the projections versus realizations in this realm. So if we look at this previous image, we could see the image that was projected for the 50s, and how this didn't happen, and at the same time, this very interesting debate in the practice has been taking place in the eastern part of the country, that is showing different offers of the urban, contradictory part of a very intensive debate that is not finished yet. In practice, people have been actively criticizing this offer by the construction of bricolage, improvised solutions that are to be seen as a critique through practicing everyday. A very interesting example, the recent one, is showing the action of these new actors in a context of a very prime location in the city, connected to the city coast, an area where there is a tourist-oriented development. A new project has been implemented, so-called local development project. And in the summer of 2020, they attempted to bring a wall that was actually limiting the access of people to the coast. This provoked very active reaction in social media by different actors, the population, the citizenry. And even though there was a quick positive response of the authorities, the event showed that there are problems with transparency in the urban transformation processes, that there was naivety in the handling of the situation, that there was a mismatch between the transformational dynamics and also with planning and managing tools, and in general, the weakness of the institutions in order to deal with this new situation. So we are in the context of a new urban situation that poses new formative challenges. And at the same time, there is a transformation in the curricula at all levels. So Cuba has a national system, which implies that there is a national program for each of the programs, even though it is adapted for specific situations in each city. At the same time, there is a new law for planning. And this is the context in which the plan has to deal with a fast evolving situation that implies new challenges. This is the context in which the new program is being built. There is a potential that is not fully covered of integration between different disciplines. So we can see here in this map 4 places in Cuba where there is a coincidence of the teaching of architecture and urbanism program together with sociology, economy, and law. But the fact is that the level of integration of these programs and the collaboration between these programs is very weak. Only the case of Las Villas is showing strengths in this area. And in that context, the new undergraduate program is recognizing the need to train architects, for example, to deal with different components of the urban dimension and different scales, and the different problems that are to be dealt with have been distributed in the new Plan A along the study. So it means that every semester, every year, the students are dealing with urban problems. And it is interesting that we have identified a set of key problems that are to be tackled along the program. So the need of creativity, the search for more humanized and inclusive spaces, the resiliency as a goal, tackling of the reduction of the ecological footprint, the recognition of vulnerabilities and other weaker areas in the city, and also the recognition of differences in society. This, of course, has been also distributed at different scales along the program. And what is interesting here is also that there has been a focus on the distinction between theory, practice, and exercising at the undergraduate level, and for postgraduate programs, a more direct focus in the interrelation between theory, practice, and research. This has implied that there has been a much clearer focus in this program that is in the making in the need of building emancipatory urban and territorial theories that are connected with self-development or urbanisms, in research, the need of a systematization of situated co-production processes, and at the same time, the need for immersion into the reality of the practice of the students. So the program is being conceived in such a way that innovation for social technical transitions become a key element, that co-production become a key component, as it is also the need for proactivity in the process of knowledge translation into practice and reality. For this, this immersion into the reality has been part of the new program. It is shorter now, it's more compact, but what distinguishes it from the previous program is that this immersion, this active, relational, collective, embedded, reflexive immersion into a reality becomes an important component of this reality. So as a final remark, we have a completely new urban situation. It requires an energetic reaction from institutions offering training and education and the promotion of the debate. We have seen how there is a focus in the articulation between undergraduate and postgraduate programs, and also how we have to learn from the specificities of our own urban situation. So that's it. Apologies for the statement.
No, not at all. Thank you so much to Jorge and to Joyce. I'm really glad that that you could join this panel and present here. And I think you also spoke very well to the question of the beyond binaries, no? In the question of Cuba as exceptional, but at the same time an epitome. If you could just stop sharing your screens so that people don't see me triple, I think that would be really helpful. And I again would just like to ask all the attendees, but then also the other panelists, if you have any questions, comments, you know, to put forward in either in the chat or in the question and answer box, please do so, because we still have some time for discussion. I would like to hand back now, I think, to Adriana. To give a round of comments on the on the second set of presentations.
Sure, Julia, thank you. I can see that I think that there is a question or comment on the Q&A. I don't know if you want to address that first, but I'm happy to go either way.
Sure, perhaps we can do that first. It's directed at Aro and Professor Mahadevia. The question was that Dr. Revi spoke about the importance of inclusion for excellence. In that context, how does language of instruction affect inclusion, especially against the backdrop of linguistic diversity? And then second, for Professor Mahadevia, spoke about the privatization of practice. Does the privatization of planning and architecture education also affect inclusion, both on the faculty and student sides? It's a really good question from, thank you, Ashima Sood. Who would like to go first on that one?
Well, maybe I can go quickly. So Ashima, that's a very good question. This is part of our everyday life. Most education in India is, as we become less and less, elite has become bilingual or multilingual over the last many years. And that's one of our core issues as far as we're concerned here. So it's not only a question of what you can teach in, the challenge is what you can examine in and how you're able to translate knowledges from one language to the other. And that's a big question. So we have a whole program that works on this. Our Word Lab is kind of organized on trying to address this question. And this is an active challenge for us as we teach. So we're committed to at least 2 languages. Sometimes in particular years, we probably are effectively dealing with teaching in maybe 3 and 4. So the faculty has to develop the capacities in a national institution to teach in maybe, whatever, half a dozen languages at least. So this is a core challenge we face, as you well know, in our everyday classrooms. And I think the same thing is for South Africa for sure, and for some other parts of the world. So English is just one hegemonic language. There are many others that we need to deal with.
Maybe I can sort of come in here. Yes, this has been a challenge of language in both ways, even faculty, from the faculty side as well, though we do tend to recruit faculty with English, sort of competence in English. But I think if the planning has to expand and we need in more communities to engage with the class and the students, we need, even from the faculty side, more diverse language competencies and flexibility and willingness to engage in whichever language is there. My understanding of the language is in terms of, so though we do stress in education emphasis on communication, my sense is that communication through any language, even one's own language that one has grown up with, is difficult if you don't have ideas what needs to be communicated. So language is the least sort of constraint in this, but I think Indian institutions will need to open up on this front, both not just for the students, but for the faculty. And secondly, what do I say about privatization? I mean, one has seen the way private schools have come up in planning. I was part of one, and over time, we saw a changing profile of students who came in. Even if one does practice diversity, like JNU, I think the situation is different, Aromar, because of the state funding to the university, whereas for private universities or institutions like yours, and now that we are, it is a hard struggle to see that you have diversity in both students and faculty. So I'm not talking about planning education, but these are issues in general of education in India today. Because I think recently the UGC University Grants Commission came up with a circular, or maybe Delhi University, that there should be marketing of courses, and only those courses which have some uptake would be offered, which means that, I mean, people might just register for courses like GIS and SPSS and so on in planning schools and not pick up planning theory courses. So I think it's just all, the entire educational system in India requires rethinking of what we are going to go ahead, and that should also be reflecting in planning education. So I have spoken about larger educational issues because that's where we are, and I know IIHS has had a lot of challenges till they have come here, and there are going to be more going ahead. So let's keep our fingers crossed on that. Yes, inclusion. One does try to look at inclusion even in the faculty recruitment, but that's also a big challenge because you do look for certain competence and certain level of educational attainment, and that itself, its hierarchized largely in Indian context.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to put forward a follow-up question that came for Aro from Aram Abdullah from the Karachi Urban Lab in Pakistan. He was asking in regards to the language questions, have you been able to formulate a glossary or operational definitions of standard urban vocabulary in Hindi or regional languages to aid with your teaching modules? We struggle with translating, disseminating our work in Urdu here, as there are hardly standard terminologies. Even urban is not fully translatable into local Urdu understandings. And the second question, which also came in, which I want to put up to no one specific, but anyone who would like to take it up. The activity in the academic and theoretical level is ongoing. How much of this is translated into the practitioner's domain, which is actually the requirement? So I think speaking very closely to Aro, your triangle of the agency, no, and the proposition.
So well. let me probably respond to the theory. I mean, the theory into practice question that said. So I mean, it doesn't always happen, and Darshini can speak to this because she's been leading this kind of process for many years. When she was at CEPT and now at Ahmedabad University, the key thing is the institutions have to be open to be able to do this, and sometimes institutional structures don't allow this to happen. I mean, as an institution, we're designed to do this as a matter of design. So, for example, we have a very large program that looks at the capacity development of practitioners, and we focused a lot in the last 10 years on developing the capacity of practitioners in the urban space, especially in public bodies. We've trained over 10,000 people in this space, and even that is a drop in the ocean. We work pretty much across every Indian state, across 700 different sort of smaller urban centers. But that is probably an order of magnitude of what actually needs to get done, at least as far as we're concerned. So that's one example that's said. The second thing is we work actively with a whole range of movements and practitioners. There's something that's actually come out of the No program, which has done very well and explored lots of new, push the boundaries in looking at training and education for people who would normally be called activists, who are very critical to reconstructing the realities that Darshini was talking about. And Edgar had dealt with briefly of planning processes, because planning doesn't happen on its own. It has to be contested, and people need to have, they need to be able to read this process. I mean, as citizens, they have the right and the opportunity to do that. So that's another thing that we've been doing quite actively. Many of us in the country have been working on this for a long time. So absolutely, it can be done, and we do it at scale in some senses, but it's not easy. And then to Abdullah, I mean, this is kind of one of our core struggles. So we have actually done this. I wish we had done it in Urdu, and maybe, we can do something jointly on this, because you've been helping us when we've got stuck with Urdu in some senses. So we're very grateful to the Karachi Urban Lab for that. But we've actually done this for 6 different languages. But it's not only a question really of the glossaries, Abdullah. The challenge is to actually translate canonical text. I mean, for example, a lot of the inspiration that we draw on many things comes from colleagues in Africa and Latin America, fine. So there's a question of, first of all, that not being accessible because it's in Spanish and, let's say, in Portuguese, and then taking that across and making that accessible in multiple languages, because the same issues have been dealt with in different contexts. So I think, we really have to build a program of transcreation in multiple languages of context. And then, for example, we have over the last many years produced a whole range of cases of how knowledges in India can actually deal with these kind of questions, and cases of other examples in other parts of the world. And I think NO and the PEAK program have been trying to do that and other things. So how does one make that available and accessible is really important. And we don't have good ways of doing this. So at the moment we crowdsource, etc. So, you know, there's an entire ecosystem there of going beyond language as a barrier, because language also becomes a serious barrier to how you think and what you can access. And it's not only a question of somebody who's coming from a non-hegemonic environment, it's those of us who don't have access to those knowledges and those experiences who are also impoverished by not having that. So yeah, so I think that's a space for collective action. It requires resources, but at the moment, I guess we need to use imagination, because, you know, machine learning and all that kind of, I mean, machine translations are, you know, Google Translate is a beginning, but it's pretty horrible if you're trying to do some deconstruction. Fine, you can come up with some really startling results if you use that. Sorry, Darshini should sort of come in.
No, I think these are very good questions. First on theory and practice. I think when we look at planning practice, we need to expand the definition of practice, because often when the question of practice comes in, the practice is looked at from the state perspective, that how much have you engaged with the state in changing its practice. What Aromar, Revi, I mean, even one does deal with state whenever the opportunity comes, which opportunities are shrinking for now. But there has been good experiences in the past. When I was at CEP, we were doing housing studio of how to deal at what level housing that gets translated into practice in terms of development of a major national program called Rajiv Awas Yojana, of building case by case, dealing with the situation of slums. So there could be in different schools a possibility of such cases. Engagement with civil society has been much more deeper, which is critical approach to planning for many of us and many of us in the planning schools. But we also have practice. I mean, I don't think I want to idealize the practice, because there could also be a situation of very, very autocratic state actions in urban space. And that could also be a practice that could be supported by a planning school. And so I think we need to be really careful when we need to have more political approach to what is a practice of planning. It needs to come with various caveats about what that practice would be, because we know also planning schools playing many roles, even in justifying many autocratic interventions in urban space I see that happening now more and more. And the planning schools often are at the sort of forefront of dealing with forgetting about what is planning, its philosophical underpinnings and so on. So that's one thing. On the language issue, I mean, it's not just that the English language or planning language been translated through to the vernacular, but often the vernacular terminologies are not reflected well in English language. For example, I was discussing with students, there's a term called jharokha. And jharokha, to translate it into English, it's not a balcony. And so, I mean, it's jharokha is a glimpse of the world outside, and there's no equivalent English term. And I'm sure from Urdu to Gujarati to all Indian languages, and maybe that's true across the world, that some of the vernacular cultural representations in the space, in the building, don't get very well captured in the English language that we are using. So that's a big challenge. And in India, it's a very, very big challenge of how to surmount that. I'm sure as we progress with practice, we'll be able to deal with it, but there is more and more demand for bringing in the vernacular in our discussions.
Thank you so much for those responses to both of the questions. I want to hand over now to Adriana to give some final remarks, and also invite the panelists and also attendees perhaps to answer some of the questions that are still in the chat on the links to theory and practice and translations. So please feel free to respond in writing there as well. Adriana.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thanks to all colleagues and friends. It has been such a rich discussion and debate. So I will very much cherry pick a few things, not all what I have learned or appreciated or really has, stuck with me throughout the 2 sessions, but a few things in the interest of time. I think that we have less than 5 minutes. The first thing to say is that, a few years ago, when we embarked with all colleagues at IIHS, Aaron, Hasri, and others, Julie, and so on, to work on, really to dive into the world of critical pedagogies in the urban turn, and again, we did that in the context of the NODE project, we found that there was absolutely no link between literatures, between debates, not just literatures, but debates. So very, very little explicit links between a world of people that are thinking about similar questions to the ones that have been discussed today in terms of similar critical pedagogy questions with a very long trajectory coming from Freire, but being oxygenated in many ways, and how that connects with the question of the urban. How does it connect with the question of planning and so on? So what is happening today, is in a way pioneering a very important gap in that discussion, and it's a discussion to be continued. So in that sense, I very much hope that most of you in the audience can also come and join us in the next 3 debates or conversations among urban pedagogues that we are going to have as part of this series. Now, very, very quickly, in terms of some of the many key things that have been said today, I think that on the one hand, we have been reminded again and again that before we even get into the question of pedagogies, of reinventing more generative, more transformative pedagogies, we are grappling with very big questions in terms of the political economy of 2 institutions that are quite hard to fight with. One obviously is the university, and the other one is planning and the planning industry. And I think that in that sense, what we heard today is that even many of the concepts that perhaps 20 or 30 years, we were using as to refer a set of values are changing. When we were talking about a public university or working for a public university 20 or 30 years ago, we could take for granted that was going to mean some alignment between questions of inclusivity, policy relevance, equality, and so on. Now we cannot do that anymore. In the same way that we cannot align inequality with or market-driven practices just with the private sector. So it's very interesting to think about this, because the first binary of the public and the private has been changed dramatically in many ways. And I think that Jorge and Joiselen from Cuba also help us to really re-problematize that binary that we need to think about. So not to go deep into that, but I think that important to think that this battle of creating, producing, pushing the boundaries for more generative pedagogies clearly is happening under very different conditions, either within institutions that are very reluctant to change, that are very market-driven, whether they're called public or private. The university is one of the main capitalist mechanisms that we see today. And also sometimes by creating new institutions. And this is clearly very much the formula of IIHS. So lots to think about that. And as Aro reminded us, systemic change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes passion, and it obviously also takes a lot of institutional will. Now, when we go into the question of generative pedagogies, again, I think that I just want to highlight a few things that I thought that were really interesting ideas to stay with and to take further in our next encounters. One takes us back to the morning. I just thought I really like when Edgar was talking, I wrote somewhere here, when he was talking about approaching pedagogy as something that we curate. I thought this is quite crucial. And I think that all of you have been talking very much about the practice of, practicing pedagogy as the practice, the art of, the art, the passion, the imagination of really curating. And that means that actually capacities for transformative change, we are saying in a way, cannot be taught, can only be learned. And I think that there is a huge difference in thinking about what can be taught and what can only be learned. And I think that, again, this is something that underpins most of the discussion that we have been having today. So that moving away from what is taught to what is learned through ways of knowing and doing, which are far more diverse, has been crucial to our discussion. Now, in that, in considering how those conditions are, or those pedagogies become generative, again, I thought that we got so many, inputs from the notion of Caren in terms of highlighting, how important it is to produce processes that are reflexive of what knowledge we engage with, whose knowledge we engage with what practices, whose practice, and also how do we engage with each other, taking the each other in a very wide sense, not only in terms of, you, me, and whoever is to the next or the right, but taking each other also as geographies, as histories, as very, very different contexts and sites of power, because we all have some form of power that we can exercise from where we are working. I thought that the next important point have to do, and I see we're push for time, so I'm going to only give the headlines of two further ideas. I think that you all talk about the importance of re-engaging in one way or another one with time in different ways. And particularly this morning, we have quite a bit of debate on that question of history. So again, how is that generative pedagogies need to land us onto it today, how we got here, but also help us to project and look at how we got there, because obviously, I mean, the whole art of planning is obviously very projectual. And as many reminded us, we're talking about there as in a future that is increasingly uncertain and has no definite science modeling and so on. So it's very, very open even to be tackled just through path dependency. So the question of, again, how we engage with these different histories, suppressed histories, hidden and forgotten histories in that sense is, I think, extraordinarily important. The second common question, and I finish here, has been that one of space. I think that across all the interventions, there has been this emphasis on situating. So any pedagogy that decolonizes needs to move away from universal claims, universal practices, knowledge that has the pretension to be universal, to be situated. But that means, and I think that what we heard today, that means much more than just going to the ground, going to the field and doing something in a neighborhood. And I think that this is extraordinarily important. We are talking about a situating, an exercise of situating that can also and needs also to be translocal. How do we create a situated between Cuba and India, between Tanzania, India, and Cuba, and so on? I think that this is in this translocal ambition of situating across, we face a lot of, if you wish, a very prolific productive field of practice. I always remember, and I finish here, something that Gautam, an anecdote that Gautam shared along, I don't know, if a year ago or so, or perhaps more, longer ago, when he was recalling the time in which he was doing his PhD in the United States, and he was told, actually, from here, we theorize, from there, India, you give testimony. And I think that subordinated treatment, in which the global South gives testimony, and certain geographies theorize and organize practice, systematize practice and so on, is at the core of what we are trying to challenge. I stop here, and apologies for going over time, and thank you so much to everyone.
Not at all. Thank you so much for those three very cool comments. And thanks to all of the speakers and to all of the attendees of the session today. I'm going to hand over to Neha now to close the session. Thank you.
I'm not going to take very long. Just to say thank you again to all of our panelists, to all of you who joined us from different time zones. Thank you so very much. We hope that this is the first of a series of conversations. There are, like I mentioned at the start, there are 3 more of the Urban Dialogues coming up. Please follow us on our newsletter, social media. We'll send out information closer to the date. with more details. And of course, we hope to see all of you here tomorrow morning for day 2 of Urban Arc. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, afternoon, rest of your days, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.